Presenters, are we ready?
We are.
Yep. Great. Okay. Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our session, Social Security Overpayments, the Basics, and How to Handle Overpayment Issues. My name is Denise Lugo-Fowler, and I'm the Director of Training and Outreach for Disability Rights New Jersey, and I'm thrilled to be the host for this morning's session. I will be monitoring the chat and supporting our speakers this morning. So some quick housekeeping items before I turn it over to our two speakers. Can you please, everyone, if they can please mute their microphones and turn off the video just during the presentation so that we can limit any background noises and other distractions. And we also have captioning available for anyone who needs it. It's you just need to click on the Zoom menu at the bottom and you will see it's either CC or it says live transcripts. Also, if you have any technical issues, please just put the question or issue in the chat box and hopefully I can resolve it. And that covers all of our housekeeping. So with that, I would like to welcome our panelists, Susan Head, who is the Senior Staff Advocate, and Charles Auslander, our Senior Staff Attorney from Disability Rights New Jersey. And with that, I turn it over to them.
Thank you, Denise. Welcome, everyone. First, I'd like to thank you for spending part of your morning with us. This presentation is about Social Security overpayments. My name is Charles Auslander. I'm a staff attorney here at Disability Rights New Jersey. And I'm going to go over the basics about what Social Security overpayments are, what you can do to either reduce or eliminate them, and basically how to handle an overpayment notice that you receive from the Social Security Administration. I want to say at the outset that because we do have a small group, it looks like this morning, this is meant to be a roundtable, not just a presentation. So what I mean by that is if you have questions at any time while I or my colleague Susan Head are speaking, feel free to raise your hand. If you can unmute yourself, please do so. You can ask the question. You can even put it in the chat box if you want. I'll stop in mid-sentence and answer your question. The goal of this meeting is to be interactive. So although I'd love to talk about Social Security overpayments and I can provide you with all sorts of useful information, which I intend to, it probably would help individual participants or attendees if you ask questions. And the reason I say all that is because Social Security in general is very complex and difficult, and handling an overpayment can be a little daunting, especially when in the back of your mind, you've received a notice that you owe the United States government thousands of dollars, maybe even tens of thousands of dollars. So you're maybe not thinking clearly and you need information. You want to at least assuage yourself that this is something that can be resolved. And that's what hopefully we're here to help you with. So please ask questions, raise your hand, put a question in the chat box if you want. You will not offend myself or my colleague if you interrupt us with a question. So with that, I'm going to begin with Social Security overpayments. People either receive supplemental security income, SSI, or Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI. There are some people who receive both, but I'm going to presume, at least for our conversation this morning, that the majority of people, the vast majority, receive one or the other. Social Security overpayments involve the Social Security Administration sending a notice to you as a beneficiary, whether you receive SSI or SSDI, indicating that they claim, the Social Security Administration that is, that they've paid you too much money, that's the overpayment part, and that you need to pay it back to the federal government. Most people, when they receive a notice like that, obviously become very anxious. They might be confused, even angry, because they think that they've followed the rules. They've reported their income if they're on SSI, same with SSD. They've insured to comply with the asset limits of SSI, which for an individual is $2,000 a month in assets, $3,000 for a couple. And when someone receives that notice, they tend to think, oh my God, what am I going to do? How am I going to pay that money back? And what we're going to discuss is in a fashion that makes it understandable. We're going to go through it slowly and sort of chunk it up, how you'll understand the process. So it's not as scary, and you can take steps to not only protect yourself, but hopefully either reduce that overpayment outright or possibly eliminate it, or if you do have to pay the full sum, to renegotiate a payment plan. So let's start at the beginning. You receive an overpayment notice from Social Security. It's first going to say what the overpayment is for, whether it's SSI or SSD. It should say it on the notice. If you're not sure, you can always go to your My Social Security account online. I encourage everyone, if you don't know what I just said, to go to the mysocialsecurity.gov webpage and open up or create an account. If you have an account already, that's great. It's a very useful website. It has your account information. It'll have your earnings. It'll also allow you to report your monthly earnings or any change in your household income or arrangements online. One of the problems that people often see with overpayment issues is that either they fail to report their income or their assets, or they don't check to see what reportable income has been provided to Social Security. Most Social Security overpayments involve a bit of a paper chase. You have to be a bit of a detective because you're going to have to look at, assuming that you're working and you're disabled, what your wage statements are from your employer, your pay stubs. Did you report that income to Social Security, or did Social Security have it reported by your employer? And there are some instances when Social Security has erroneous information. The information reported by third parties like your employer might be incorrect. It might be misstated, and that causes problems. So you receive a Social Security overpayment notice. You first determine, is this for supplemental security income or Social Security disability insurance? There's two different ways in which to handle overpayments depending on which benefit you're receiving. We're first going to start with SSI recipients, supplemental security income. Now, you obviously receive benefits monthly, but you also have asset limitations. And I referenced that earlier when I said you can't have more than $2,000 in assets per month. If you go over that amount, you might be in violation of SSI rules. If that's the case, it might cause them to send you an overpayment notice. It may even cause the termination of your benefits. But it's very important to take very close look at the Social Security overpayment notice you receive. If you don't receive a notice from Social Security saying you have an overpayment, you might likely not have one, at least not officially. Social Security is required by law to send to you a notice, and it has to have very specific information on it. It has to indicate affirmatively that you're alleged to have an overpayment. It has to indicate which month or months the overpayment occurred in. Social Security calculates overpayment by months. It won't do it over, say, an annual period of time. So they may list month and year to month and year. That's okay, that's a period of time. And then you'll know how many months between that period it's alleged you received monies the government claims you shouldn't have received. And then in addition to having the amount and the months, it'll explain the reasons why they believe there's an overpayment. That last part is very critical because if they don't tell you why you have an overpayment, you're going to have to figure it out on your own, and that shouldn't be the case. And I'll explain in a little while what's called a request for reconsideration. It's really a fancy phrase for an appeal where you can make Social Security recalculate what they put in the notice and explain to you step by step why you have an overpayment in any given month. So remember, you need to receive a written notice from Social Security if they allege you have an overpayment. If you're on SSI, and that's what we're dealing with right now, they'll have the amount of the alleged overpayment, the month or months they claim it occurred, and the reasons why they believe an overpayment occurred. All right, so now you have this notice. What's the next step? You have different options in dealing with an overpayment. Some of this will apply to SSDI, and I'll get to that in a little bit during the presentation. With SSI, it's very important once you receive that notice to look at the date of the notice. If it came in an envelope, assuming it's ordinary mail, which I presume it will be, save that outside envelope. It might have a postmark on it, the date that it actually says it was mailed, and then you'll have the date on the overpayment notice indicating when it was either produced or mailed. The reason that's so important to get those two dates, ladies and gentlemen, is that you have a right to appeal that request for reconsideration I mentioned earlier, but, and there's always some sort of but when it comes to the government, if you want to appeal, there are two time dates, deadlines you have to keep in mind. The first is if you want to continue your benefits as an SSI recipient, you need to file your request for reconsideration within the first 10 days. It's extremely important. Now, if the postmark on the envelope and the date on the letter are way backdated more than 10 days, don't worry. You still file your appeal, your request for reconsideration within 10 days, and you can mention in a separate letter that this is the date on the letter, this is the postmark on the envelope. And you want to make sure that you send that letter when you appeal that request for reconsideration by certified mail, return receipt requested. The reason you want to do that, and that's an example of proving that you've mailed this document to the Social Security field office, is that if you pick up the phone and you call Social Security and you say, well, this is the quickest way to get a hold of someone within that 10-day period, no one there is going to have documentation that you contacted them in a timely fashion. Even if you were to fax something, which you can do, and you can certainly get a confirmation from your fax machine, you're still always better off mailing something return receipt requested. Now, if you also want to fax it in addition to mailing it, that's great. Belt and suspenders. It's always good to have a little bit of redundancy built in with the Social Security Administration, especially during COVID, because the federal government has not been receiving their mail in a timely fashion. And I've had instances where people have timely filed letters of appeal, requests for reconsiderations, and they allegedly haven't been received when in actuality they were received, but no one has gone through the mail yet. So the request for reconsideration is a form, and I'll ask Susan to put a link up there to that form. It's a SSA 561, and that's a form that you're going to fill out. It's really a simple form. It's about really one page of information. Some of it's pedigree information. Some of it asks for a brief explanation why you think Social Security did not properly calculate the overpayment, or maybe even that they're completely wrong, that the information they have about your income and your assets is just erroneous. But once you fill that form out, you're going to make copies for yourself. And this is another important lesson. In addition to mailing everything to the Social Security Administration by certified mail return receipt requested, always keep copies of everything you receive or send to Social Security and keep it in a separate dedicated folder or binder. You're going to need that later on if there's a dispute down the line. Now, technically, you have a total of 60 days to file an appeal, that is a request for reconsideration. SSI recipients need to file it within 10 days just to make sure they keep their benefits flowing while you're disputing the amount of the overpayment. If you do it within 60 days, but after 10 days, you still have a right to appeal, but your benefits are going to end up stopping. And that's not what you want to have happening if you dispute the amount of the overpayment. Now I'm going to stop for a moment and I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions, because that's a lot of information I just gave on starting a request for reconsideration on an SSI appeal. Does anyone have any questions? And please don't be shy. That's what we're here for today. You can raise a hand, put it in the chat box. I see a question here about the ABLE account. That's a really good comment from Lori Schaller, and I'll talk about that once I get through a little bit more on SSI and SSD, but it's a good way to shelter income in the Achieve a Better Life Experience accounts here in New Jersey. So there's no questions. We know that we get this notice. It has detailed information. We know we have to file a request for reconsideration within 10 days to keep our benefits flowing. We definitely have to file it within 60 days so we don't lose our right to appeal. What happens when you file that document in a timely fashion? So the bottom line is this: when you file that form, you're forcing Social Security to recalculate or recompute the alleged overpayment, meaning they have to go back over their documents, see what income or resources have been reported to them, and then double check their math to make sure that the allegation of an overpayment is accurate and correct. That will take some time. That's okay. Because you have timely filed your request for reconsideration in 10 days, your benefits will keep going. Even if you miss it and you file it within 60 days, your appeal is still pending. Now, there are a few things that can happen. You may ultimately have a paper review of your file, that is, the Social Security Administration will just simply go through all the documents, or you may ultimately meet with a representative. I'll talk about that a little later. I'm going to switch over now to SSDI recipients because it's a similar but not exact process. If you're receiving Social Security disability income benefits, you have a limit on the amount of earned income you can earn monthly. It's called your substantial gainful activity limit. Each year, Social Security has a monthly limit for people who are either blind or non-blind disabled, and it's published freely. You can find it on the internet. So when you receive SSDI benefits and you receive an overpayment notice, again, it's going to have similar information. It'll have the amount of the alleged overpayment. It'll have the month or months that Social Security alleges you're in violation of your SGA, that maybe you earned too much money in any given month. And lastly, they'll explain the reason why. It could be that you worked too much, or they may even be challenging that you're disabled. There are things called a continuing disability review, where Social Security periodically, every few years, it could be between 3 and 7 years, checks to see if a recipient of SSDI is still eligible for benefits because of their disability. That may be a reason that you receive a notice that you were terminated and now there's an overpayment because it's alleged they kept paying you benefits either after the fact or at the time they alleged you were no longer disabled and no longer eligible for benefits. But similar to SSI beneficiaries, and SSDI beneficiaries going to receive an overpayment notice with those 3 key pieces of information. Well, what does an SSDI recipient have to do if they want to appeal an overpayment? They too have to fill out that same form that's posted in the chat box. The difference is this: an SSDI recipient has to file that form within 30 days. The SSDI recipient has 60 days to file an appeal, just like an SSI recipient, but the SSD recipient has a little more time. However, if the SSDI recipient does not timely file their request for reconsideration in 30 days, their benefits are going to stop. You're just simply going to fall off the edge of a cliff. You're not going to have those benefits. So just like the SSI recipients who have to file in a certain time period, same thing with the SSDI recipients. Again, you fill out that form if you're an SSDI recipient with an overpayment notice, and then you're also going to mail it in, certified mail, return receipt requested, and keep copies of everything you receive or send to the Social Security Administration. The same thing applies. You want to compel the Social Security Administration to recalculate their alleged overpayment. Force them to tell you as an SSDI recipient what sources of income they're counting, which months, and what information they possess. This applies to both SSI and SSD. Please either go to your My Social Security account or create one. It makes life a lot easier to find out what information Social Security has while you're waiting for your request for reconsideration to wind its way through the Social Security Administration. Again, I'm going to take a brief pause to see if anyone has any questions so far about appealing an overpayment notice, whether you're an SSI recipient or an SSDI recipient. Please don't be shy or type questions into the chat box. We're here to explain sort of a complex, arcane topic. Okay, I don't see any questions, so I'm going to move on. So we've talked for a little bit about requests for reconsideration. What's another way that you might be able to reduce or eliminate an overpayment that you receive when you get a notice from Social Security? Another way to do it is a waiver. It's a request for a waiver. Now, a waiver is different than a reconsideration. A reconsideration is an appeal where you're claiming the Social Security Administration either may have made a mistake or is completely wrong in claiming you have an overpayment and you owe money to them because you received too much in benefits. A request for a waiver, or an application for a waiver, as it's sometimes called, is asking the government to relinquish their right to make you pay the money back. They're waiving or giving up their right to have that money repaid by you. Now, a waiver doesn't have a time limit to be filed, which is a very good thing. That means you can file a request for a waiver at any time, unlike those strict time limits that I gave you earlier, one for SSI recipients, one for SSDI recipients. So both Social Security beneficiaries can file a waiver at any time. We generally recommend that you file a request for reconsideration first, that appeal, so you make Social Security double check its math and see if they haven't made a mistake in reducing or terminating your benefits. But you can always subsequently file an appeal if your request for reconsideration is unsuccessful. A waiver requires a different form. And again, Susan will eventually put a link on there regarding that request for a waiver, but it's unfortunately a very long form. Social Security is a bureaucratic agency and they run on specific forms. The form for requesting a waiver is about 14 pages. There's some good news and there's some bad news. Social Security recipients who receive SSI, supplemental security income, need to only fill out the first 3 or 3.5 pages of that lengthy form. Unfortunately, SSDI beneficiaries have to fill out the entire form. The reason that's the case is because SSDI recipients have to provide lots of financial information on that form about their monthly expenses, their various sources of income, both earned and unearned. SSI recipients, given the nature of that program, are assumed to have either little or no income to begin with. They may be practically destitute. So it's essentially presumed they don't have any other sources of income or assets. And since they have all these limitations and resources they can have, they're not required to fill out the entire form, whereas SSDI recipients are. Remember, Social Security disability income recipients have a limit on what they can earn, but not necessarily unearned income. So they have to fill out the entire form. Regardless, if you fill out that waiver form, the SSA 632, you're going to mail it to Social Security. Again, certified mail, return receipt requested. Keep copies of everything you send them. And eventually they'll respond. You may ultimately receive a phone call. You may receive a notice in the mail. If not, they'll do a paper review of your file after a certain amount of time. In both instances, whether it's seeking a request for reconsideration or an application for waiver, if you're dissatisfied with what a Social Security field office representative has said to you, either on the phone or in a personal meeting, assuming the COVID pandemic subsides and we can go back to field offices, you'll always have the right to ultimately challenge any adverse determination before an administrative law judge at a Social Security office. This is a brief webinar, so I'm not going to get into the complexities of that. I just wanted you to know that even if you're denied in a letter when you file a request for reconsideration or a waiver, you can always end up further appealing an adverse determination by ultimately going before an administrative law judge in the Social Security Administration. So thus far, we've covered appeals, reconsiderations, and also waivers where you ask the government to forgive the amount because you either don't have the income or the resources to pay it back. This is a little caveat on waivers. There's something called an administrative waiver in Social Security. If your overpayment is $1,000 or less, whether you're an SSI or an SSD recipient, you're able to contact your local Social Security field office. And once obviously you've identified yourself and provided contact and pedigree information, you can request orally, and you can also do it in writing. And again, I would do both. I would follow up with a letter, mailed, certified, return receipt requested, but you can call them. And if it's $1,000 or less your overpayment, Social Security will generally, but not always, waive that amount because they believe that's a relatively small sum. And from an administrative standpoint, they're not willing to have people file requests for reconsiderations and waivers. There's more paperwork. It's a longer process. So if it's something like, say, a $900 overpayment, my suggestion is first see, in addition to filing a request for reconsideration, if you can also ask for an administrative waiver. you can file a letter, and then also follow up with a phone call asking for it. Our experience has been that many representatives will waive it on the phone because it's under that amount, as long as there's no indications of fraud or bad faith on your part. They're willing to just let it go because it makes sense from an administrative point of view. I'm going to take another break here and ask if anyone has any questions. And then we put up some information on the chat box with the two forms I've just discussed. Anyone have any questions?
So Charlie, there's a question in the chat box from Carrie about what about receiving pandemic-related unemployment assistance, such
Yes.
as increased unemployment benefits, and how does this affect my SSI eligibility?
Very good question. And Carrie, you may be reading my mind because that was one of the issues we'll get to, and we'll get to it right now. What happened with the original stimulus payments they gave back in March of 2020, when the pandemic, officially was called a pandemic, they called these stimulus payments. And the problem was that they would increase the income for people. And I'll talk about SSI people specifically. They're limited on their income. They're limited on their resources or assets they can have, for an individual it being $2,000 a month. Well, it started originally with stimulus payments, and then subsequently they began increasing the amount of unemployment benefits, which is different, right? Words matter because they define things. What ultimately happened is, and this is the short answer, none of this will count towards resources or income for either Social Security or SSDI beneficiaries. That's the quick answer. I'll ask Susan to put a link in there to what's called an emergency message that the Social Security Administration put out. It was late July of this year. There was a lot of advice when the stimulus payments came out, and the stimulus payments were exactly that, money given to people to spend to hopefully stimulate the economy. The original rules were that Social Security beneficiaries who got these benefits had to spend them within 12 months, or they might be considered income. No longer the case. There were, I think, a total of 3 stimulus payments, and you had 1 year from the time you received each stimulus payment to use it up, pay it down, so it wouldn't be income. Then we had these other increased unemployment benefits. There was the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, the Federal Pandemic Unemployment Compensation, and the Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation. So you had this word salad of aid that Congress sent out, and it greatly increased unemployment benefits. At one point, it was $600 on top of what your state gave. It was subsequently continued but reduced to $300. And it also included part-time workers, because some state unemployment schemes require you to seek full-time employment. And it included people who are entrepreneurs, who were self-employed, like the gig workers. So it was very broad legislation. And as of July, I think it's 23rd of this year, that emergency message that was put up basically said all this aid that Congress gave in the last year and a half, whether it's a stimulus payment, whether it's increased unemployment benefits, whether it's any sort of extra aid, we will not, and I'm emphasizing the adverb not, count it as income or resources. So it shouldn't affect people during the time the pandemic is still officially a health emergency. The reason I mentioned that caveat, the emergency message, if you click on that link, has a very useful chart, and that chart will list all the different forms of benefits that have come out: stimulus benefits, increased unemployment benefits, increased coverage of unemployment, because every state is different in how much unemployment benefits it'll give you. New Jersey's relatively generous. We give 26 weeks. Florida, I believe, gives either 12 or 13 weeks. The federal government paid not only to increase that amount, but also the length of time that you could recover. In any event, Social Security's emergency message provides guidance that all of the benefits that are in that chart don't count towards income, don't count towards resources, as long as you receive it during the pandemic emergency period. So I know it may be a longer answer, but at least it's a comprehensive one, and I hope it relieves everyone's anxiety about whether they're going to have problems. I'd also mention that if you receive an overpayment notice and the overpayment relates, that is the month or months of the overpayments, relates to March of 2020 to September of 2020. There's also guidance indicating that Social Security will essentially automatically waive those overpayments, assuming there's no bad faith or indications of fraud. Because in March of 2020, when the entire country shut down very suddenly, Social Security was part of that shutdown. It could not handle overpayments, even if you timely send in notices. So there is guidance. Maybe Susie can find that link. Otherwise, I can also provide it. That between March of 2020 and September 2020, overpayments during that time will be forgiven essentially outright. Maybe in that emergency message as well towards the end. But that's another good thing to understand, that there are exceptions. If you have questions and at the end of this we run out of time, you can always contact Disability Rights. Our intake unit can answer some of those questions. We provided those people with materials and documents. You can also look online, but if you'd like to speak with someone, we can provide you with that advice. I'm just checking to see if there's any more questions, because we certainly encourage them. I don't see any yet. So I'm going to go on to the next step. We talked about reconsiderations, right? An appeal, challenging the overpayment. We've talked about waiver, which is essentially asking for forgiveness and saying, I don't have the income or the resources to pay this money back. The next thing would be to renegotiate a payment plan. It may be that your reconsideration or appeal fails. Again, you can challenge it up all the way to an administrative law judge, or even further if you like, but that's kind of beyond the scope of what we're doing here. If you're in that circumstance, contact the intake unit of Disability Rights New Jersey, and we can talk about your specific case in more detail. But if you've managed to appeal and you were unsuccessful, or maybe you were partially successful, you reduced the amount, but you didn't fully eliminate it. You then tried to waive the remaining amount. Maybe you were successful a little bit, maybe not. The next step would be to negotiate a repayment plan. And they're pretty generous, Social Security, in doing that. I mean, the lowest amount you can pay under their official regulations is $10 a month. Depending on your income sources, your support, the family makeup that you have, whether you're receiving support from other sources, they'll take all that into account, and they can either recoup money from your Social Security payment, or they can make other arrangements to pay it back. They generally have as an outline number 3 years. If there are hardship factors where even paying monthly X amount of money over 3 years won't pay back the overpayment, you can try to work around that rather than having them recoup all of your money. They can't do that fully with Social Security recipients. The maximum recoupment is 10%. With SSDI recipients, they can recoup much, if not all of that money. But that would be the third way to deal with your overpayment, is to negotiate a payment plan that you can afford. And then lastly, although this seems maybe obvious, you could simply do nothing. If you do nothing, you don't appeal, you don't file a waiver, which doesn't have a time limit, you don't negotiate a payment plan, Social Security will just simply implement the overpayment notice by recouping money back. They're limited with SSI to 10%, not so with SSD. They'll simply stop your payments and they'll recoup that amount of money back. If they're unable to recoup it, you're still going to owe that money. It's an actual debt to the United States government that you're going to eventually have to resolve either by paying it, negotiating it, or making some other arrangements how you're going to pay it. So those are the 4 ways to handle overpayments. There are significant differences and more complex ones between overpayments on SSI and SSD. At this point, I'm going to ask if anyone has any questions before we go into maybe some other areas, just to be broad and cover some other issues that may come up with overpayments. Does anyone have any questions? Anyone want to place anything in the chat box?
You can also unmute yourself if you'd like.
Oh, yes, I'm sure you have permission to do that.
Raise your hand. So please, feel free to do that as well.
So no questions. All right. Well, let me say one or two other things. I'm going to ask Susan other ways, and this is a little bit more detailed, that you might be dealing with an overpayment. there are things called impairment-related work expenses, or OREs. And Susan, I'm going to ask you to talk maybe a little bit about how OREs can help reduce overpayments when you receive that notice.
Sure. So Social Security has what's called work incentives. And these are special rules for individuals who receive benefits, who want to transition to work or maintain employment. There are a variety of work incentives. One of them is called impairment-related work expenses. And this allows Social Security beneficiaries, both SSI and SSDI, to submit to Social Security any out-of-pocket medical expenses that they need in order to maintain employment. So it might be a special kind of medication that the person needs for employment. It might be a particular form of transportation. As long as the expense submitted to Social Security is directly related to the person's disability, Social Security will consider that expense against the overpayment. And sometimes just by submitting that out-of-pocket expense and asking Social Security to consider it against any overpayment, that may substantially reduce an overpayment. And in certain cases, it might waive the overpayment. In a moment, I will put into the chat box a chart, a Social Security chart of what Social Security thinks or considers to be eligible impairment-related work expenses, as well as a list of expenses that Social Security will not consider. The other work incentives that Social Security has, and I'm just going to read these out. They are expedited reinstatement of benefits, which we can talk about in a minute if anybody has questions. Special subsidies, so for individuals who are working and they may not be working necessarily at 100% of their colleagues' output. If an employer pays that individual for their work and covers that individual for 100% of their work output, in the event of an overpayment, it is possible to ask Social Security to deduct the amount that the employer pays above the individual's work output and consider that against the overpayment. So I'm also going to put into the chat box a link for New Jersey Work Incentive Network support. And as most of you probably know, this organization provides free beneficiary counseling for individuals who receive benefits and want to go back to work, want to maintain employment. They will set up a individual free session with that individual and explain how much a person can earn before they're getting into the kind of gray zone of incurring an overpayment. It's a great service, and I would definitely encourage anybody to contact New Jersey WINS if you are working and receive benefits, or you're even thinking about going back to work. All right, there we go. I'll put these links into the chat box. So if anybody has any questions about that information, please unmute yourself or put your question into the chat box.
Does anyone have any questions thus far about anything that we've discussed this morning? You can always go backwards. We don't have to keep going forwards if people have questions. Okay, well, it looks like we're coming up, I guess, on 5 minutes. I'd like to just note some things that people should keep in mind to avoid overpayments, because that's the goal. You don't want to be on the radar of the Social Security Administration and receive a notice, even if it's erroneous or it has some minor issue with it. And this is the bottom line. It's always important for you to timely report any and all income or resources that you have. In my opinion, it's best to open up a My Social Security account and do it electronically. You can certainly mail in your payments. Again, that means you're going to have to keep copies of everything and mail it return receipt requested or some other secure way, so you have proof that you mailed your reported income payments to them. And the reason that's important for both SSI and SSDI recipients is it's usually because someone ends up either working too long, either overtime, or there's a change in their family or work arrangements where they receive either resources or benefits like rent or food or something else. That tends to happen more with SSI recipients. But those are the things that when they happen, they'll happen on month A, and then on month G, 6-7 months later, Social Security picks it up and then you get an overpayment notice and you're confused and you go, how is that possible? Well, if you have good records and you maintain them, you'll be able to go back and see what are they talking about when you get that overpayment notice. Now, the overpayment notice may be wrong, but if you keep records and you timely report any changes in income, your regularly monthly income, any changes in your resources, it makes life a lot easier to deal with an overpayment. Because if it's Social Security's mistake, you have documentary proof, right? You have paper proof that you can use to defend against the overpayment notice. So we also recommend that if people are on SSI or SSD, they have a dedicated bank account where they have a direct deposit just of their public benefits and they don't put anything else in there. This way you can always go to a bank and have records about what money was put in there, what money was taken out. And you can show, for example, if you're a Social Security recipient on SSI, that you never exceeded $2,000 in your bank account, for example. So timely reporting of all your income to Social Security and timely recording of all your income with paperwork that you keep on file, a big file just dedicated to your benefits, including bank statements, goes a long way to avoiding overpayments. And if you have one, hopefully successfully challenging or defending against it. I already mentioned reporting changes in your income as well as your living arrangements regarding whether you're married or receiving benefits from another third party. That could easily trigger an overpayment. We talked about documenting everything that you send to Social Security, keeping copies, mailing it in a secure way to prove that you've mailed it and Social Security has received it. It's just very important. I can't emphasize that enough, to keep copies of everything you receive from SSA, notices, documents, earnings statements, everything. Just keep it. If you put it aside and you don't deal with it or lose it, it's going to cause a problem. And then, as I indicated, creating a My Social Security account, I strongly recommend, in addition to having your dedicated bank accounts for your benefits. All of these things will hopefully avoid an overpayment notice. But unfortunately, if you receive one, all those things will also help you challenge and hopefully prove that you don't owe the money at all, or if you do, you owe far less. So with that, I think we're just about out of time. Does anyone have any last minute questions they'd like to ask?
If nobody does, just super quickly, I will mention that the My Social Security account is really helpful for reporting your wages, both SSI and SSDI. You will get a receipt that you've reported your wages. So that in that case, there's no dispute about the fact that you've reported your wages. You can request a replacement social security card. You can do all sorts of things on this My Social Security account. It is really the best way to correspond with Social Security.
It's all good advice. Thank you, Susan. Anyone have any last minute questions? I think we're almost at the end here.
I don't see any in the queue. So I just want to say thank you, Susan and Charlie. A lot of great information, a lot of great resources in the chat there for everyone. And I thank everyone for sharing this time with us today. And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.